At the end of the Second World War, there were many brutal war criminals who were brought to trial, and a number were sentenced to death. Some of these people experienced shameful public executions, which were carried out in front of thousands of people who wanted vengeance. The Soviets even carried out this form of justice whilst the war was going on. In this documentary, we look at 5 examples of public executions and how some of the most awful war criminals met their ends. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Tani Hisao was born in December 1882, and he was born into a farming family. He had a relatively normal upbringing, but then he enlisted in the Japanese Army's training academies, and he graduated from the 15th class in 1903. He was not at the top of his class, but Tani then was drafted into the Japanese Army. He saw combat during the Russo-Japanese War and was promoted to second lieutenant as part of the Guards 1st Infantry Battalion. He had initially trained as an artillery soldier, but he transitioned across to being an infantry one. But following this conflict, he continued to train at the Army War College, and he wrote accounts of his experiences on the battlefield, and he interviewed many other survivors and published a book titled The Secret History of the Russo-Japanese War. This book was highly thought of in Japanese military circles, and it did become required reading for those who studied at the Army Staff College, but there were a few Japanese generals who criticised it, saying it was not an accurate account of the conflict. But Tani was clearly a talented member of the military, and he became a military diplomat and travelled to Great Britain as a military attaché from 1915. He then became an official military observer during the First World War, and he would report back the combat situation on the Western Front. Following heading back to Japan, he then worked as an instructor at the Army Staff College where he studied, and he imparted his knowledge onto new students who wanted to become soldiers in the Japanese Army. Tani Hisao remained inside of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he was appointed to become the commander of the 61st Infantry Regiment before he became the Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division. But then Tani became part of the League of Nations Standing Committee and was an expert on military aircraft, and in August 1930 he was appointed to being a Major General. He continued to act as a commander in different divisions and regiments, and further promotions came his way before he served as a commander of the Tokyo Bay Fortress. However, it was clear in the Pacific that a huge war would break out, as the Japanese sought to expand and conquer and look towards China. Hisao Tani had been charged with restructuring the 6th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, and in July 1937 the division was assigned to the Japanese China Garrison Army. They were then thrust into combat and fighting in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and they then took part in the Battle of Baiping-Tianjin. But following this it took part in further operations against the Chinese, before it became part of the 10th Army and attacked Chinese soldiers at Hangzhou Bay. Tani Hisao's soldiers then transitioned to become part of the 18th Division and the 14th Division. They were then involved inside of the Battle of Nanking, where they were involved in the Nanking Massacre. On the march to the city, there were many Japanese war crimes committed everywhere by the Japanese forces. There was a mentality of brutality, and there was even a killing contest that took place between 2 officers who had a competition to see who could massacre 100 civilians with a sword the quickest. This was publicised in newspapers almost as if it was a sporting event, and the score was reported like a football match. But as the Japanese reached Nanking, they issued a demand to surrender, and they received no response, and for this it was then ordered that Nanking was to be taken by force. What came next was chaos inside of the city. There was a heavy artillery bombardment, but from the 13th of December 1937, there were random acts of murder, assault, looting and arson inside the city. The crimes continued for weeks, and what people saw inside Nanking was hell on earth. One witness wrote, "The Japanese have looted widely yesterday, and today have destroyed schools and killed civilians, and assaulted women. 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers, whom the International Committee hoped to save, were taken from them, and by this time are probably shot or bayoneted. In our South Hill house, Japanese broke the panel of the storeroom and took out some old fruit juice and some other things." The horror inside the city continued, and another witness said, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of brutality almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. Let me recount some instances occurring in the last 2 days. Last night, the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were assaulted. 2 girls about 16 were assaulted to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there were 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night, over the wall, stole food, clothing, and assaulted until they were satisfied. They bayoneted one little boy of 8, who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that penetrated his stomach, but I think he will live. It was Tani Hisao's forces who were part of the massacres and the crimes. For days the terror continued, and another said, 2 Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear, they give the excuse that they saw 2 Chinese soldiers climb over the wall. When I show them my party badge, they return the same way. In one of the houses in a narrow street behind my garden, a woman was assaulted and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we could take her to the Kulo hospital. Last night, up to 1,000 women and girls were said to have been assaulted. About 100 girls in Gingling College alone. You hear nothing but terror. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality of the Japanese soldiers. Tani then, following this, returned to Japan, and he became commander of the Central District Army before he went to the reserve. But following the bombing of Hiroshima, he was then brought back into active service to command the 59th Army, and these soldiers were part of the final defensive effort by the Japanese Empire to deter Allied landings of Japan. But then following the surrender, he was demobilised. However, then a warrant for Tani's arrest was issued, and he was arrested in February 1946 and was charged with Class B and Class C war crimes. But as he committed many of his crimes in China, Tani Hisao was extradited to the country to stand trial at the Nanking War Crimes Tribunal. When presented with the charges, he denied them all, and said that his soldiers were disciplined in Nanking, and he said the area of Nanking his soldiers operated in was evacuated mostly. But no witnesses could identify his unit numbers, and there was evidence presented to the court saying he actually operated in different areas that he said. But the judge refused his request to call his chief of staff and other officers to become witnesses, and the judge said that due to the witnesses who saw his soldiers rampaging throughout the city, there was simply no need. There was some controversy regarding his trial, but the ruling of the court said that all Japanese commanders who took part in the Battle of Nanking had an equal responsibility for the horrors that took place inside of the city, and because of this, they were judged as guilty. Tani Hisao, despite the fact he was not the most senior general involved in the battle, was sentenced to death, and he was then taken to Nanking and the mountain nearby where he was to be killed. There was a huge crowd that had gathered to witness his execution. There was a small firing squad that had been gathered to perform it. Many of the people who witnessed Tani's execution had been hiding during the atrocities, but Tani was then ordered to kneel down in front of the crowd. Then an executioner went up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Tani Hisao was a Japanese general who was convicted of war crimes, and he was a commander whose soldiers were involved in atrocities in China. He was a man who was in his 60s when he was executed in front of a crowd of thousands, but he had a long history inside the Japanese army. Hisao was a man whose direct involvement in crimes in Nanking was disputed, but he was executed for the fact the courtroom applied the shared responsibility clause, meaning that any commander inside of Nanking was condemned to death and guilty. The stories of Nanking were tragic and were horrific, and the whole city was a scene of depravity and terror. Stjepan Filipovic was born on the 27th of January 1916 in Opuzan in now modern-day Croatia. His family moved throughout the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and Stjepan lived in a number of different towns and cities, including Kragujevac, which today is the 4th largest city in Serbia. Whilst here he studied locksmithing, electrical wiring and carpentry, getting a number of trades behind him whilst he was still young. In 1937 he joined a labour movement and began to become a political activist in a number of different local groups. Eventually Filipovic was arrested for his actions within the political groups, and he was sentenced to a year in prison in 1939, before he was then released at the end of his sentence. After leaving prison, he then decided to continue his political activism, in particular joining the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. It would not be long before the Germans decided to invade Yugoslavia. The invasion was a brutal one, and Germany attacked from all sides, being helped by the Italians and the Hungarians, their allies. During attacks on the capital Belgrade, it was heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe, but the invasion initially did not last long. Within 10 days, the Royal Yugoslav Army had announced its unconditional surrender, being overwhelmed by the Axis on the 17th of April 1941. The Yugoslav army was poorly trained and equipped, with a lack of resources compared to the huge German war machine. The Germans rampaged through the Yugoslavian territory and quickly overwhelmed the army, and although the Yugoslavs put up a fight, it was in vain. A significant amount of the population refused to fight and take arms, instead welcoming the German liberators, who they deemed were there to free them from the oppressive government regime they had been suffering under. However, inside the state, there were two significant groups that would emerge, the Chetniks and the partisans. In 1941, Stjepan Filipovic was based in the city of Valjevo when the Nazis invaded and occupied Yugoslavia. In the early part of 1941, he joined the Kolubara troops of the Valjevo partisan detachment. The political ideology of the Nazis was completely opposite of the communist one held by Filipovic, and he rose throughout the ranks inside the partisans. He became a commander within another partisan group in Valjevo. He also carried out his work well and was placed in charge of recruiting new members into the partisans, and also was placed in charge of securing supplies, weapons, ammunition and equipment for the group. Now there was a difference between the two significant resistance groups within Yugoslavia. The Chetniks and the partisans both had different ideas and went about things in different ways. Despite going against the Nazis, the Chetniks were originally ethnic Serb Yugoslav soldiers who escaped the Axis army. They then ran into the hills of Bosnia, Montenegro and Serbia. They were led by Mihailovic, a former colonel in the Yugoslav army. Their numbers did grow when the Serbian peasants who fled from Croatia joined them, however non-Serbs were not allowed to join. The Chetniks tended to shun large-scale fights and acts of resistance against the Germans, as they were worried that the Germans would retaliate with bloody reprisals, massacring villages for example. Being cautious did bring them into conflict with the other group, the partisans. The partisans were led by Tito, and their goal was to simply get rid of the Axis occupation and instead create an independent socialist Yugoslav state by freeing the country from the occupiers. The partisans included all ethnic groups, and they often had problems with the Chetniks, as they preferred more direct action, coming into dispute with the Chetniks. They wanted to get rid of the Axis threat, but the Germans worked on the rule of 100 executions of civilians for every German soldier that was killed. The Chetniks and the partisans themselves were rivals, despite fighting for a common cause. Stjepan Filipovic ended up being a commander of a partisan unit. However, during action he was captured on the 24th of December 1941 by the Chetniks. The Chetniks then handed him over to the Gestapo headquarters in Belgrade, and he was subject to interrogation. The Nazis did not manage to break him, but he was questioned about his partisan activity. The SS officer in charge noted how Filipovic's case was an impossible one, as it could not be broken. His case file was marked with a red pen, and he was sentenced to death to be hung publicly in Valjevo, in front of a large crowd. One of the strongest and most shocking images of the Second World War was the execution and death of Stjepan Filipovic, which was captured by secret photographers. He was dragged through the streets of Valjevo, defiantly opposing his executioners, the Nazis. He was screaming, "Long live the liberators of the people, down with the racist and the collaborators, long live communism." With all the commotion, more people joined the spectacle, and he was taken into the square. He arrived at the gallows where the huge crowd gathered, and he was taken onto the gallows, which was a wooden frame set up in the square. Underneath the wooden gallows was a bench, in which Filipovic was told to stand upon before his death. As he stood on the bench, a noose was made from thin wire and rope and was tied around his neck and fastened. With the noose around his neck and facing death, Filipovic cried out to the crowd in a defiant manner, asking for the crowd to rise up too. He screamed, "What are you waiting for? Why are you allowing this? Grab those rusty rifles and free your country from this scum. Long live our liberating army, death to fascism, freedom to the people." With his arms aloft, inciting the crowd and firing them up in his defiant stance, the photograph was then taken. As the German soldiers approached him, Filipovic even tried to kick a soldier to get him away, and the soldier then punched him in the face. In a desperate attempt to strike back, he then slipped off the stool and the noose tightened under him, and Stjepan Filipovic slowly strangled to death. Interestingly, the iconic photograph of Filipovic was taken by a 17-year-old schoolgirl who worked in a photography studio. She was asked to take photos of the hanging. However, the Germans were worried about the images of Filipovic that were attracting a lot of publicity. The girl, Vasic, helped to distribute the copies and was even arrested and interrogated as to whether she was working for the partisans or not. She spent 2 weeks in prison whilst the Germans tried to capture all of the copies of the photograph. There was one copy that remained. It was in the hands of a local doctor who worked for the partisans, but he gained the trust of the Germans. The doctor was then able to seize the photograph, hiding it under a rug, when the Germans investigated his place, and the photograph was then released into the wider world. In Valjevo today, a statue of Stjepan Filipovic stands defiantly as a constant reminder of his defiance and bravery when facing his death. It stands aloft with its arms, standing as if Filipovic did, staring death in the face. As he stood on the gallows, he called for the death of fascism and for the end of the Nazi occupation, trying to rally those in the city to rise up against their occupiers. Today his heroic act is seen as a symbol of resistance against the Nazis, and in 1949 he was declared a national hero. Following the launching of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the German army rampaged through the Soviet lands, and Kharkiv or Kharkov would become a focus of many major battles. The city was captured by the Nazis and placed under occupation on the 24th of October 1941, and a Red Army offensive failed to recapture the city in May 1942. It would be retaken in February 1943, but a month later would fall again to the Germans. This put the city and the people of it under a significant amount of danger and stress, and before the occupation there were a huge amount of refugees who remained in the city. But the Jewish population would be slaughtered by the German army. They and the Einsatzgruppen, the SS death squads, would carry out a huge amount of slaughter in and around the city, and they would between December 1941 and January 1942 massacre and then bury around 15,000 Jews in a ravine outside of a nearby town. These had been taken from Kharkov, but also around 30,000 residents were executed by the Germans as they were suspected of being Soviet partisans, and 80,000 people also died from hunger, disease and the cold. Further horror occurred as 60,000 people were forcibly transported to Germany to work as slave labourers, but others were also sent to concentration camps. By the time the city was liberated, the population had been reduced to under 200,000, and 70% of the city had been destroyed. It was said in one article that the city was more battered than perhaps any other Soviet city, except Stalingrad. But all around the lands, the Germans would commit a significant amount of slaughter and execution. But when the city was liberated for the last time, the officials inside would then try to punish war criminals who had conducted horror in Kharkov. Further atrocities were committed by the Wehrmacht and Einsatzgruppen, including hangings and the use of gas vans. The Gestapo would round up and shoot 435 patients who were being treated inside of a local hospital, and many of these were elderly people and children. In March 1943, there were 800 Red Army soldiers who were also shot, and many others were burned alive. The Soviets would state that in the Kharkov region, the German fascist invaders had shot, hanged, burned alive, and poisoned by carbon monoxide gas more than 30,000 peaceful, completely innocent citizens, including women, old people and children. But the Soviets would uncover the mass graves of the victims. There were virtually no Jews who had survived the German occupations. But then a trial was summoned in December 1943. This was known as the Kharkov trial. The point of this was to bring 4 war criminals to justice, and these were men who had been linked to implementing the policies of the Germans, which resulted in such horror and bloodshed. There were 4 defendants who had been captured and brought forward, despite hundreds committing crimes in the city. These defendants were 3 Germans: Wilhelm Langheld, who was 52 years old, Reinhard Retzlaff, who was 36, Hans Ritz, a 24-year-old man, and one Soviet collaborator, Mikhail Bulanov, who was 26. The Germans were members of the Wehrmacht, the police and SS forces, and Bulanov was a man who was accused of treason against his homeland. All of the men were charged under Soviet and international law, and Langheld, Retzlaff and Ritz were accused of participating in the murder and slaughter of Soviet soldiers. The officials presiding over the court were military men, and a 6-person forensic team provided witness and expert testimony in which they documented the shootings and also the use of gas. They would tell the courtroom of the suffering of the victims. It was claimed that these men, the defendants, were Teutonic Knights of the Great Eastern Expanse, who daily and hourly carried out Hitler's orders without feeling good feelings and pity, destroyed civilians who were proud of their cruelty, considering these subhuman worthy of only mass destruction. Their actions led to many thousands of residents mercilessly having violated their rights to live and their rights to defence. They would claim that everyday killings and executions entered the flesh and blood of the executioners, including the Gestapo, and that the defendants were absolutely alien to the idea of good, and they had no organ for its perception. The defence of the 4 men said that they had been just following orders, and this was acknowledged, but was rejected as a sufficient defence, and because of this the 4 men were found guilty of their crimes and were then sentenced to death. The court found that Wilhelm Langheld had been personally involved in a number of cases in which 100 innocent Soviet prisoners of war and civilians were shot and then executed. Hans Ritz had directed the shootings which were carried out by the SD Einsatzgruppe in Tagarog, and it was found that he beat prisoners with rods and truncheons and tortured them for information and false statements. Reinhard Retzlaff was found guilty of torturing Soviet civilians and trying to get false statements from them. It was said he ripped out their hair and tortured them with needles and would order the executions of dozens of civilians. It was said he also drove prisoners into a murder van, and these citizens were then gassed, with Retzlaff then overseeing the burning of their bodies after. Mikhail Bulanov, the Soviet, was found guilty of betraying the Soviet motherland, and he voluntarily sided with the Germans and worked for them as a chauffeur for the Kharkov Gestapo branch. He took part in the executions of civilians using gas vans, and also drove civilians to their executions where they were then shot. When the evidence and verdicts were announced to the courtroom, the room turned to stone as these men were found guilty of being machines of mass murder, and in particular the treason of Bulanov hurt the Soviets. This was a man of the city who was a cog in the machine of mass murder of these people. But the routine killing of people shocked everyone. The men did all plead guilty, and they admitted their crimes and described them in detail, but the Soviets would not wait to carry out the executions of the men found guilty at the Kharkov trial. The very next day the 4 men were taken out into the public square of Kharkov for their execution. It was the 19th of December 1943, and at the time in the war vicious fighting would still be erupting, but in Kharkov there were 50,000 people who came to see the executions of the German soldiers. There were 4 gallows which had been made in the town, and each of the men were brought out into the square for their execution. They were accompanied by a number of guards and officials. Thousands of people were gathered around, and they saw the men hanged. It was said of the executions, it was all over in a few moments. The defendants were hoisted into the back of 4 open trucks and stood on stools. Then the nooses were looped around their necks. There was no blindfolding. During the preliminaries, 3 of the 4 prisoners had to be propped up. Bulanov had fainted. Ritz and Retzlaff had turned pasty white. They drawled at their mouths, and their knees gave way. Only Langheld, the old soldier, remained stiff as a ramrod throughout, never once flinching. Once the nooses had been adjusted, at a signal the trucks pulled away, and the 4 were left dangling and kicking in midair. For the people of Kharkov, the executions of the men who had worked for the SS, the German army and the Gestapo, was some form of revenge and reprisal for the suffering of the people inside the city. It was a city which suffered greatly, and for many people these were the most evil war criminals. But there were many more who committed crimes during Operation Barbarossa who were never brought to justice. Ferenc Szalasi was born in January 1897, and he possessed some rather strange and bizarre beliefs from an early age. He believed he was given a divine right to rule or have power, and that God had passed this on to him through his mother's milk, which he was fed as a child. Surprisingly, he lived with his mother even until 1944, whilst the Second World War was in full swing and before he came into power. But as a young man he joined the army, following in the role that his father served inside of society. He attended a military academy to train as a soldier, but was promoted to the rank of lieutenant, and he then became an officer inside the Austro-Hungarian army. This was during World War I, and he was on the front lines for 3 years, which was considered long-serving, as many soldiers during the conflict lasted just a matter of minutes in the trenches, as they were then sent over the top, being drafted to the front to perform this death dash to the other side. Szalasi began on the Italian front, but he was then transferred to the Western Front, and he finished the war at Verdun, the scene of many tough battles. But after the conflict had come to an end, he appeared to abandon any political beliefs that he ever had, and he may have been deeply affected by what he witnessed during the conflict. Hungary as a nation was struggling politically with a number of different changes, but Szalasi was far from this, and he remained inside of the armed forces and saw himself with more of a military career than one inside of politics. He embarked upon general staff officers training and attended different military academies. His teachers thought that he could one day become a general because he was so well liked by other members of the military, and he had a distinct tactical understanding, which was better than others. He was viewed as a skilled and intelligent man and commander. However, other soldiers thought he had too much power within the armed forces for his ability and experience, but he was promoted to the rank of major. The political situation, though, inside of Hungary was a huge issue in the 1930s, and there was a huge amount of upheaval and chaos. Gyula Gumbos was appointed as the Prime Minister, and Szalasi, when this happened, then became more significantly politically motivated, and he switched his desire to rise through the military to a wish to rise throughout the political circles and gain power. He formed a right-wing nationalistic ideology, and wanted Hungary to push forward and expand its borders to what they previously were, as the country had been shrunk by around 72% of what it had been as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He began to write different political pamphlets, but at the time soldiers within the military were banned from getting involved in the nation's politics, and for this work he was imprisoned for 20 days and was sacked from the army's general staff. When he was released, he became a lowly staff officer and turned his back on the army once and for all to focus and devote his time on politics. His first political party was known as the Party of National Will, and this nationalistic party was quickly banned as it was seen as being too right-wing and radical. However, Szalasi then established in 1937 the Hungarian National Socialist Party, which was based upon Hitler's Nazi Party. It was anti-Semitic, and after the Anschluss of Austria, his growing followers became more radical and dissenting, and for this he was yet again imprisoned. But whilst he was in prison, he was declared the National Socialist Arrow Cross Party leader, and this was a coalition of right-wing groups, and many people flocked to the cause, and this gained around 30 seats in elections, but would then become one of Hungary's biggest political parties. When the Second World War occurred, the Arrow Cross Party became banned, and Ferenc Szalasi was ordered to conduct his political work in the shadows, but the Nazis and the Germans did support what he was trying to do, and he would later come to power propped up by the Germans. This came late in the war, and in March 1944, Hitler ordered the invasion of Hungary, and the Nazis then occupied the region. Hitler had launched Operation Margaret, and his soldiers were ordered to storm into Hungary, and he began by placing Dom Szotje in power as the Prime Minister, but the government then legalised the Arrow Cross Party, and Szalasi was allowed to attract more people to the cause legally. The Prime Minister was quickly overthrown, and Szalasi was declared an enemy of the government, and he was ordered to be arrested by the regent, but he was protected by the Nazis, and the regent wanted to end Hungary's involvement with the Axis forces. However, the Germans had kidnapped his son, and they threatened to kill him if he did not abdicate and place Ferenc Szalasi in power as the Prime Minister. This led to Szalasi completing a meteoric rise to the top of Hungarian politics, and his Arrow Cross Party were now in power, with Szalasi being named the leader of the nation, but he was in theory running a Nazi puppet state. He appointed 16 ministers. Half of these were his close allies within the Arrow Cross Party, but with the war still going on, he put in place a number of plans which pleased the Nazis, and he instigated the persecution laws that had caused so much death and destruction across Europe. His government promoted martial law, and executed many people who were considered their enemies politically, and under his regime thousands of people were deported to concentration camps, and they were then exterminated within the gas chambers after arriving at the camps. He was not in power for long, to be specific 163 days, but these were dark days, filled with slaughter and death, and people disappearing. He also sent large amounts of resources and food to the Germans, and many people inside of Hungary began to starve and suffer even more. But at the time the Soviet forces were already inside Hungary's borders, and were fighting with the Germans and remaining Axis forces, but despite this his party sent 80,000 people to concentration camps. On the 19th of November 1944, Ferenc Szalasi had really nowhere to go but hide as the war was coming to an end for him, and Budapest, where he was holed up, was being encircled and surrounded by the Soviets, Romanians and other forces. This led to a 102-day siege of Budapest, and he did somehow manage to get out. He fled the city and went to the west, and he then went to Vienna and on to Munich, hoping that Hitler would get him some form of safe passage out of the trouble. Meanwhile in Hungary, as the country capitulated, the Arrow Cross Party was dissolved, and many people fled to save themselves before the Germans surrendered. However, on the 6th of May 1945, Ferenc Szalasi was arrested by American soldiers, and he was then sent back to Hungary to stand trial. He was brought in front of the People's Tribunal in Budapest, and his government through this had executed many different people. Ferenc Szalasi was indicted on war crimes and high treason, and he was said to have been a Nazi collaborator who deported thousands of his own people, who were then slaughtered. He was someone who was hated by the Hungarians, and he was then condemned to death. On the 12th of March 1946, the former leader of the nation of Hungary was taken from his prison cell in Budapest, and specifically he was taken outside of the Academy of Music within the city. Here there were many execution posts which had been created for the execution of prominent members of the Arrow Cross Party, and Szalasi was brought out after two of his former ministers had been executed using pole hanging. This was also known as the Austrian gallows, and a post was used to execute rather than a gallows with a trapdoor. Szalasi walked past the hooded bodies of his former ministers still on the post, and the executioner and his assistant helped him up onto it. He was secured in position using a chest sling, and the executioner secured his arms and legs so he could not move, and then the ropes were passed through a pulley system. The executioner was situated behind the post, and it was his job to manually dislocate the neck of the former politician, and he then secured the noose around Szalasi's neck. When the executioner gave the orders for the drop, Ferenc Szalasi's body plunged a matter of feet, and the executioner did his grisly task, and he was left slowly strangling to death, as his neck did not snap. He struggled as much as he could, and the executioner then placed a white cap over his head to prevent thousands of people seeing his final moments. Ferenc Szalasi's body was then cut down, and it was buried inside the new public cemetery inside Budapest. He was a hated figure within Hungary in the final days of the war, and his government and party led to thousands being killed and also many people suffering and starving, as he gave large amounts of food and resources to the German army. He is remembered today as one of the most ruthless collaborators of the Second World War, who met his fate being executed on the pole in front of a large crowd. The Germans launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, and it was the largest land offensive in history, and over 10 million soldiers would take part in it. The Germans wanted to rampage to the east, and they would want to claim lands for German settlers to live in, and to begin with, the invasion surprised Stalin. The Germans and Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact years before, and because of this it took the Red Army by surprise. Hitler had been planning this for some time, and over 3.8 million soldiers of the Axis powers would invade the Soviet Union, along an almost 3,000-kilometre front. They were supported by 600,000 vehicles and over 600,000 horses, and it was a huge operation. The invasion would open up the Eastern Front with the Germans fighting on two fronts, and on the Eastern Front there were some of the most brutal and bloody battles fought in history. Battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk saw thousands killed, and the Germans deliberately starved 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, and millions of civilians died as part of the hunger plan. There were many mass shootings and gassings, carried out by the Nazis, who would use the SS death squads, the Einsatzgruppen. These would follow the German army, and they would round up civilians and often force them to dig their own graves, and in these pits the civilians would be led into them before executioners on the edge of the pits stood and shot them. The German soldiers rampaged throughout lands, and many towns, villages and settlements were burned to the ground. Belarus would be fully occupied by the German military, and it had been ruled for 20 months before by the Soviets, and the Germans invaded, and the country would then suffer heavily. There were bloody battles in which cities were encircled and civilians suffered, and during the early days of the occupation, a Soviet partisan movement came around. Partisans would hide around in the woods and swamps, and they inflicted a lot of damage to German supply lines. They would blow up railway tracks, bridges and other infrastructure used by the Axis soldiers. They also ambushed German soldiers, and during one attack, 4 German trains carrying Tiger tanks were destroyed, and the Germans had to also fight partisan activities, as well as the Soviets. But there were a huge amount of war crimes carried out by the German army, and there were 380,000 people deported for slave labour from Belarus, and hundreds of thousands were executed. The Germans wanted to exterminate the complete Slavic population, and over 9,000 settlements were burned and destroyed in Belarus. Ghettos were then set up, and one was established inside of Minsk. The ghetto here housed 100,000 Jews, and inside of here the conditions were terrible, and the Germans would slaughter and execute at different times. A second ghetto would be created, and here every night around 70 people were executed when they got there from other countries and lands. Jews were forced to work in factories or other German-run industry, and in March 1942 the Nazis liquidated a nursery and orphanage. It was said of this horrific event in Minsk that, at that moment, several SS officers, among them Wilhelm Kerber, arrived, whereupon Kerber, immaculate in his uniform, threw handfuls of sweets to the shrieking children. All the children then perished in the sand. There were pits where thousands of Jews were executed and killed, and the ghetto was liquidated on the 21st of October 1943, with most of the inhabitants then being sent to the Sobibor extermination camp. But at the end of the Second World War, a series of war crimes trials were held in the city, and in various cities around the Soviet Union, and in different lands to punish Nazi war criminals. The Minsk trials took place in 1946, in the capital of Soviet Belarus, and those brought to trial were members of the German military and SS officials who had caused chaos inside of the country. 18 men were placed on trial and were accused of crimes committed during the occupation of Belarus, and this included 11 members of the Wehrmacht, including 2 Wehrmacht generals, 4 members of the Nazi police, a police general, and 3 members of the Waffen-SS and SD. Johann Georg Rickert was a German general who commanded the 286th Security Division and also the 35th Infantry Division. His soldiers conducted operations against partisans, and Rickert ordered that all of his own soldiers who were in hospital without injury or diagnosed illness were to be executed, and he was a brute who threatened other commanding officers. He would force around 40,000 civilians into a death camp, and the establishment of this camp was said to have been one of the worst crimes the Wehrmacht ever committed against civilians. He was one of those brought to trial, alongside Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf, another general who commanded the Ordnungspolizei in the Minsk region. General Erdmannsdorf established Fortress Mogilev and held this position, but he was accused of the deportations of 10,000 people, destructions of villages, schools and churches. He was also linked to the shootings of disabled people during the constructions of fortifications and the use of people as human shields. He was also accused of the establishment of camps where people were sent to. Eberhard Herf was the commander of the Police Regiment North and Order Police units in Minsk. He would encourage and order the mass murder in the Army Group North Rit area, and then became the commander of the Order Police in Minsk, where he was in control of the mass murder of Jews in the ghetto there. He became a general in the Order Police, and it was said he eventually wanted to get out of the East as he had had enough. But he was responsible for the executions of thousands. Also brought to the Minsk trial were George Robert Weissling, commander of the 26th SS Police Regiment, Ernst August Falk, battalion commander in the 26th SS Police Regiment, Reinhard George Moll, the local commander of the Babrusk, Karl Lenz, the commander of a POW camp, Hans Hermann Koch, chief of the SIPO, and an Einsatzgruppe officer, Rolf Bouchard, special commander in Babrusk, August Bittner, Sonderführer, and chief of the farm slave labourers, Bruno Goetzer, commander, Paul Eick, a deputy commander, Bruno Mittmann, a soldier in Minsk, Franz Hess, a Sonderkommando member, Heinz Fischer, an SS cavalry corporal, Hans Höchel, a Wehrmacht private, along with Alois Hetterich and Albert Rodenbusch, 2 other Wehrmacht privates. Inside of the courtroom, all of the men were accused of crimes against humanity. They were all convicted of the horrors carried out in Belarus. But 14 of those were sentenced to death, and their executions would be carried out inside of a horse racing venue in Minsk. The 3 generals were all condemned, and to the people of Minsk who had suffered greatly under German occupation, these men were evil. They had seen their friends and family members slaughtered and executed, with many being sent to concentration camps. And these trials in Minsk were considered like the Nuremberg trials. But on the 30th of January 1946, those men who had been condemned to death in the Minsk trials were brought out to their executions. A huge gallows site had been created in the horse racing venue in Minsk, which was known as a hippodrome. 100,000 civilians had gathered to see the executions of those men who had been sentenced to death. They were brought out one by one to the gallows. On the gallows, a number of nooses had been placed, and then the men were placed on a vehicle, and the noose was then tied around their necks before the vehicle was then pulled off, and each of the men were left there dangling and hanging. 14 of them were hanging from the gallows at the same time, and to the people of Minsk who had suffered greatly, these executions of these men were completely justified. The German soldiers in Minsk were all condemned for the mass slaughter they had participated in across Belarus and the Soviet Union. They had been involved in the executions of civilians and the deportations of thousands to concentration and extermination campsites, where they were then killed when they arrived. The country suffered heavily under German occupation, and the Nazis caused chaos there. But some of those executed were military generals, and these were high-ranking members of the military that rubbed shoulders with Hitler.